Nobody noticed the little girl. Not when she walked into the room. Not when she smiled at the other children. Not when she quietly raised her hand, hoping someone would take it. And not even when the first tear rolled down her cheek. Everyone had someone. She didn't. The music was playing. Hundreds of people were laughing, talking, and dancing beneath the warm lights. Children were spinning across the floor. Parents were smiling. Couples were moving together with the music. And somewhere in the middle of all that happiness stood a 7-year-old girl who had no one to dance with. She had come to see Elvis Presley. That was supposed to be the memory she carried home. The night she saw Elvis. The night she heard the music. The night she stood in the same room as one of the most famous men in the world. But she had no idea that before the night was over, Elvis would notice the one person everyone else had overlooked. The little girl stood quietly at the edge of the dance floor. She watched the other children. One little boy was dancing with his mother. Another girl was laughing as her father spun her around. 2 children were holding hands, moving awkwardly to the rhythm. The little girl smiled. She wanted to join them. So she took a step forward. Then another. She looked directly at the children. She smiled again. And waited. Nothing. Nobody invited her. Nobody moved toward her. The children continued dancing as if she wasn't there. The little girl slowly stepped backward. Her smile faded. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She looked around and found another group. They were laughing together. She walked toward them. This time she stood closer. She lifted one tiny hand. Just enough to let them know she wanted to dance. For a moment she waited. Then the children turned away. The little girl lowered her hand. She looked down. And suddenly, the music didn't sound quite as happy anymore. She tried another group. Then another. Each time the same thing happened. No one was cruel to her. And somehow, that made it hurt even more. Nobody told her to leave. Nobody shouted at her. They simply kept dancing. As if she wasn't there. As if she were invisible. The little girl finally stopped trying. She stood alone. Her hands folded together. Her shoulders slightly lowered. She stared at the floor. One tear escaped. She quickly wiped it away. Then another came. She wiped that one away too. She didn't want anyone to see her crying. She was only 7. But in that moment, she was learning something no child should have to learn so early. Sometimes you can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel completely alone. Then she heard the crowd react. She looked up. And there he was. Elvis Presley. The man she had come to see. He stood surrounded by people. Adults wanted to talk to him. Fans wanted to get close. Everyone seemed to have a reason to be near Elvis. The little girl simply stared. For a few seconds, she forgot about the children. She forgot about the tears. She forgot that nobody had chosen her. She looked at Elvis and smiled faintly. Then a thought entered her mind. A crazy thought. A thought she knew probably wouldn't work. Maybe Elvis would dance with her. She almost laughed at herself. Of course not. Elvis was Elvis. She was just a little girl. He had people surrounding him. He had places to go. People to meet. A room full of adults demanding his attention. Why would he notice her? She looked down again. Then she saw her reflection in the polished floor. A tiny girl. Standing alone. And something inside her broke. She looked toward Elvis one more time. Then she made a decision. She was going to ask, not because she expected him to say yes, but because she couldn't stand there wondering what would have happened. So she took a breath and started walking. One step, then another. The crowd suddenly seemed enormous. Adults moved past her. People talked around her. Someone nearly bumped into her. She stopped. Her heart raced. For a second, she almost turned around. Nobody would blame her. She could go back. She could pretend she had never tried. But then she remembered how it felt when nobody took her hand. So she kept walking. Closer, closer, until she was only a few feet away from Elvis. He was speaking to someone. Then he noticed her. He stopped. His eyes moved down. And there she stood. A tiny 7-year-old girl. Quiet, nervous, trying desperately not to cry. Elvis looked at her face, then at her eyes. He immediately noticed the tears. His expression softened. He leaned down. "Hey, sweetheart." The little girl looked at him. She didn't speak. Elvis smiled. "What's your name?" She quietly told him. He repeated her name. And something changed, because she had spent the entire night being overlooked. And now the most famous person in the room was saying her name. Elvis smiled. "Well, it's nice to meet you." The girl finally looked directly at him. Then Elvis asked, "Are you having a good time tonight?" The little girl's smile disappeared. Her eyes moved toward the dance floor. Elvis followed her gaze. He saw the children dancing. Then he looked back at her. He understood. But he didn't interrupt. He waited. The little girl looked down. Her fingers began twisting together. She was fighting the tears again. Elvis lowered himself a little more. "What's wrong?" The girl hesitated. She wanted to say it, but she was afraid. What if he laughed? What if he told her he was busy? What if he walked away just like everyone else? She took a shaky breath. "Elvis." Her voice was barely audible. He leaned closer. "Yes." The girl looked into his eyes. And finally, she said the words she had been holding inside all night. "Nobody will dance with me." Everything seemed to stop. The little girl immediately looked down. She regretted saying it. She expected the same thing she had experienced all night. Another person turning away. But Elvis didn't. He simply looked at her. For several seconds. He said nothing. Then he glanced toward the dance floor. Hundreds of people were still moving. Still laughing. Still celebrating. Then Elvis looked back at the little girl. And the expression on his face changed. There was no superstar in that moment. No stage persona. No performance. Just a man looking at a child who had been made to feel invisible. Elvis slowly extended his hand. The little girl stared at it. She didn't move. She couldn't believe it. Elvis smiled. "Come on." She looked at his face, then at his hand. He kept it there, waiting. And then he said the words she would remember long after the music stopped. "If nobody will dance with you." He paused. "Then dance with me." The girl's eyes widened. She looked around as if she needed to make sure he was really talking to her. Elvis nodded. He was. The little girl slowly lifted her hand. Her tiny fingers touched his. Elvis gently closed his hand around hers. And at that exact moment, people began turning toward them. One person stopped talking. Then another. A few heads turned. The music continued. But the room was beginning to notice what was happening. Elvis Presley was holding the hand of the little girl nobody had chosen. He took one step toward the dance floor. She followed. Another step. She followed again. Her fear slowly began disappearing. And then Elvis led her into the middle of the room, the very same dance floor where she had stood only minutes earlier. Alone. Now she was standing there beside Elvis. The crowd went quiet. The little girl looked up at him. Elvis smiled. Ready? She nodded. The music began again, and Elvis took her hand. What happened next would make the people watching forget about the song entirely. The music started again. But this time, the room was no longer listening to the song. Every eye had moved toward the center of the dance floor, toward Elvis Presley, and the tiny 7-year-old girl holding his hand. Only a few minutes earlier, she had been standing against the edge of the room, trying desperately not to cry. Now, she was standing in the middle of it, beside the man everyone had come to see. Elvis looked down at her. She looked up at him. For a second, neither of them moved. The little girl suddenly became nervous. Hundreds of people were watching. She could feel their eyes. Her fingers tightened around Elvis's hand. Elvis noticed immediately. He leaned toward her and smiled. Don't worry. He paused. You're with me. The girl's eyes lifted toward his face. She took a slow breath. And then Elvis gently moved to the music. Just one step. The little girl watched, then copied him. One step, then another. At first she was extremely careful. She looked down at her shoes after every movement. She was afraid of doing something wrong. Elvis noticed. So instead of making the dance serious, he made it playful. He exaggerated one of his steps. The girl looked up. She stared at him for a second. Then she laughed. It was the first real laugh she did all night. Elvis smiled. There you go. The girl laughed again. And suddenly, something changed. She stopped worrying about the people around her. She stopped thinking about the children who had ignored her. She stopped wondering whether she belonged. She was dancing. And for the first time that night, she was having fun. Elvis gently turned her around. She came back toward him laughing. The crowd began clapping. One person, then another, then dozens. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. The sound grew louder. But Elvis didn't look at the crowd. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge the attention. His eyes stayed on the little girl. Because he wasn't performing for them. He was dancing for her. The little girl looked around. People were smiling at her. Some were clapping. Some were laughing. A woman near the edge of the room covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes were wet. The little girl noticed. She looked confused. Why were people reacting like this? She wasn't doing anything special. She was just dancing. But the people watching understood. They weren't simply watching Elvis dance with a child. They were watching a little girl go from being completely alone to becoming the center of everyone's attention. And Elvis had made it happen without saying a single grand speech. He had simply taken her hand. The girl looked up at him. Am I doing it right? Elvis smiled immediately. You're doing perfect. The girl's eyes brightened. She smiled. That sentence meant more to her than Elvis could have known. Because earlier that night, she had been asking herself whether something was wrong with her. Why didn't anyone want to dance with her? Why did everyone keep turning away? Why did she feel different? And now the most famous person in the room had looked at her and told her, "You're doing perfect." She believed him. The music continued. Elvis kept dancing. Then he suddenly stepped backward. The girl looked at him. He held out both hands. "Your turn." She froze. "What?" "Dance." The girl looked at the crowd. Her eyes widened. "No." She shook her head. She was suddenly shy again. Elvis smiled. "You can do it." She looked at him. He nodded. "I'll be right here." The girl took one tiny step. Then another. She moved by herself. The crowd began clapping. She smiled. Another step. Then she spun. She almost lost her balance. She laughed. The crowd laughed with her. Elvis applauded. "That's it." The girl became more confident. She started moving to the music. Not perfectly, not professionally, but joyfully. And that was all that mattered. Elvis stepped back toward her. She immediately grabbed his hand again. The crowd erupted. The girl laughed. And for a few moments, there was no sadness, no rejection, no feeling of being different. There was only music, laughter, and a little girl finally enjoying the night she had dreamed about. Then, the girl suddenly stopped. She looked up at Elvis. Her expression changed. The happiness on her face slowly faded. Elvis noticed. "What is it?" She hesitated. She looked toward the floor, then back at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She took a breath. "Why did you dance with me?" Elvis paused. The question was simple, but it carried something much deeper. The girl genuinely wanted to know. Why her? Why had he chosen her? Why had he stopped when everyone else had continued walking? Elvis crouched down until they were almost eye to eye. He smiled. "Because you asked me." The girl shook her head. "But you didn't have to." Elvis looked at her. "No." He paused. "I didn't." The girl looked confused. Elvis gently touched her hand. "But sometimes people don't need much." He looked toward the crowd. "Sometimes they just need someone to notice them." The girl stared at him. She didn't completely understand the meaning, but she understood the feeling. Someone had noticed her. Elvis had noticed her. The girl looked down. Then she whispered, "I thought nobody liked me." Elvis's smile disappeared. He became serious. "Never think that." The girl looked up. "Never, never." He squeezed her hand. "There is nothing wrong with you." The girl remained silent. Her eyes became wet again. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. Elvis smiled. "Now look around." She turned. The entire room was watching. People were clapping, smiling, cheering. Some of the children who had ignored her earlier were now looking at her differently. The little girl looked confused. Elvis smiled. "You see all those people?" She nodded. "You've got plenty of dance partners now." She laughed, and the crowd laughed with her. The music became louder again. Elvis took her hand. They danced once more. But this time, she wasn't the frightened little girl standing against the wall. She was confident. She spun around. She laughed. She moved with the music. She wasn't watching anyone anymore. She didn't care who was looking. For the first time that night, she felt like she belonged. Then Elvis did something unexpected. He stopped. The girl looked up. "What's wrong?" Elvis pointed toward the children. One of them was slowly walking toward them. Then another. Then another. The girl stared. The same children who had ignored her earlier were now coming closer. One little boy looked nervous. He stopped in front of her, then slowly extended his hand. The girl stared at it. She didn't move. She looked at Elvis. Elvis nodded. The girl reached out. She took the boy's hand. And suddenly, the boy smiled. Another child joined. Then another. Within moments, the little girl who had been standing alone was surrounded by children. She started laughing. They danced together. The crowd erupted. Elvis stood nearby, watching, smiling. He didn't need to be in the center anymore. He had already done what he came to do. The little girl looked back at him. Her eyes were shining. She mouthed, "Thank you." Elvis smiled. Then she suddenly ran toward him. She wrapped both arms around him and hugged him tightly. The crowd became silent. Elvis looked surprised for a moment. Then he gently wrapped his arms around her. The little girl held on. She didn't want to let go, because somewhere inside her, she knew this was more than a dance. This was the moment she had been waiting for without even knowing it. The moment someone finally told her, "You belong here." She pulled back, looked at Elvis, and whispered, "I'll never forget you." Elvis stared at her. His expression softened. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't forget yourself either." The girl smiled. Then she returned to the other children. The music continued. The crowd began applauding again. But Elvis remained still for a moment. He watched the little girl dance. The same girl who had been crying alone was now laughing in the center of the room. Then suddenly, a man approached Elvis from the side. He leaned toward him. His expression was serious. "Elvis." Elvis turned. "What is it?" The man glanced toward the little girl, then back at Elvis. "There is something you need to know about that little girl." Elvis's smile disappeared. He looked toward her. She was still dancing, still laughing, completely unaware of what was being said. The man lowered his voice. "She didn't come here just to see you." Elvis frowned. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated. Then he said something that made Elvis's expression completely change. "She came here because..." He stopped. Elvis waited. The music continued behind them. The little girl was still smiling. But Elvis was no longer smiling, because what he was about to hear would make him realize that this little girl's lonely night was about much more than a dance. And suddenly, the simple moment on the dance floor had become something neither Elvis nor anyone else in that room would ever forget. Elvis stood completely still. The music was still playing. Children were still dancing. People were still smiling. But Elvis could no longer hear any of it. His attention was fixed on the little girl. She was laughing now. Only minutes earlier, she had been standing alone. Now she was surrounded by children. And yet, the man's words were still echoing in Elvis's mind. "She didn't come here just to see you." Elvis turned toward him. "What do you mean?" The man looked uncomfortable. He glanced at the little girl again, then lowered his voice. She had been looking forward to this night for a very long time. Elvis listened. She knew she was going to see you. He paused, but she was afraid. Afraid of what? The man hesitated. Then he answered. She was afraid nobody would want her there. Elvis's expression changed. He looked back at the little girl. She was smiling, but suddenly he understood something. That smile hadn't always been there. She had been fighting for it. The man continued. She told someone earlier that she was worried the other children wouldn't let her dance. Elvis looked down. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked back at the girl. She was 7 years old. She shouldn't have been worrying about whether she belonged. She shouldn't have been wondering whether anyone would accept her. She should have been thinking about music, about dancing, about having fun, about being a child. Instead, she had spent part of the night trying to convince herself that she deserved to be there. Elvis took a slow breath. Then he said quietly, "That's enough." The man stopped. Elvis looked toward the little girl. "I want to talk to her." He walked toward her. The little girl noticed him. Her face immediately lit up. "Elvis." She ran toward him. He smiled and crouched down. "Hey, sweetheart." She looked at him. "You came back. I told you I'd be here." The girl smiled. Then she looked toward the other children. "They're dancing with me now." Elvis looked at them. "I see that." She smiled proudly. "They're my friends." Elvis smiled. "That makes me happy." The little girl looked at him for a moment. Then her expression became serious. "Are you leaving?" Elvis paused. There was something about the way she asked that question. It wasn't really about Elvis. It was about everyone who had walked away from her that night. Elvis understood. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "I have to go eventually." The girl's eyes dropped. "But," Elvis lifted her chin gently, "leaving doesn't mean forgetting." She looked at him. He continued, "You understand?" She nodded. Then she asked, "Will you remember me?" Elvis smiled. "I think I'll remember you for a long time." The girl smiled. Then she suddenly wrapped her arms around him again. Elvis hugged her. The room became quiet. Hundreds of people watched. Nobody laughed. Nobody talked. For a few seconds, there was only a little girl holding onto Elvis Presley, and a man holding onto her, as if he understood exactly how important that moment was. Then Elvis pulled back. He looked directly into her eyes. "I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Next time you want to dance." He smiled. "Don't wait for someone to choose you." The girl stared at him. "Why?" "Because you can choose yourself." She thought about that. Then she smiled. Elvis continued, "If someone says no, find somebody else." He pointed toward the children. "And if somebody doesn't want to dance," he smiled, "dance anyway." The girl laughed. Elvis laughed too. Then he held out his hand again. "One more." The girl's eyes widened. "One more dance. One more dance." She grabbed his hand immediately. The music began again. And this time, the entire room joined them. People clapped to the rhythm. Children danced around them. Adults smiled. Some people wiped away tears. Elvis moved slowly with the little girl. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't looking at the floor. She wasn't checking to see who was watching. She was simply smiling. And then Elvis did something unexpected. He gently spun her around. The girl laughed loudly. The crowd erupted. She came back to him. And Elvis said, "See." She smiled. "I can dance." He nodded. "You can." She looked up at him. "And people will dance with me." Elvis smiled. "Exactly." The music continued. The little girl danced faster. She wasn't the lonely child from earlier anymore. Something had changed. Not because Elvis had magically fixed everything, but because someone had given her one simple thing: confidence. He had shown her that being ignored didn't mean she was unwanted. Being different didn't mean she was less important. And standing alone didn't mean she would always be alone. Eventually, the song began to fade. The applause grew louder. Elvis gently took the girl's hand. The little girl looked up. "Is it over?" Elvis smiled. "For tonight." She became quiet. Then she asked, "Can I see you again?" Elvis paused. He looked at her. Then he smiled. "I hope so." The girl nodded. She seemed satisfied. Then Elvis did something she would never forget. He gently squeezed her hand and said, "Remember tonight." She smiled. "I will." "Remember how you felt when you were standing alone." She nodded. "Remember that too." The girl looked confused. "Why?" "Because someday." Elvis paused. "You might see somebody else standing alone." The girl's expression changed. Elvis continued, "And when you do," he pointed gently toward her heart, "you'll know what to do." The little girl nodded slowly. "You dance with them." Elvis smiled. "Exactly." The girl smiled. Then she ran back toward the other children. But before she disappeared into the crowd, she turned around. "Elvis." He looked at her. She shouted, "Thank you." Elvis smiled. He raised his hand. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Then she disappeared into the crowd. Elvis stood there watching her. For a long moment, he didn't move. The room slowly returned to normal. People began talking again. The music changed. Children continued playing. But Elvis remained quiet, because something about that little girl had stayed with him. He had met thousands of people. He had performed for enormous crowds. He had heard millions of voices scream his name. But sometimes, the moments that stay with you aren't the loudest ones. They're the quiet ones. The moments when one person looks at you and says something that nobody else has heard. And that little girl had done exactly that. She had walked toward Elvis when she was afraid. She had asked him for a dance when she believed the answer might be no. And because she had been brave enough to ask, she had discovered something much bigger than a dance. She had discovered that being rejected by some people doesn't mean you're unwanted. That being different doesn't make you less worthy. And that sometimes, one person noticing you can change the way you see yourself. Years later, she might not remember every detail of that night. She might forget the exact song. She might forget the lights. She might forget the faces in the crowd. She might even forget what Elvis was wearing. But there was one thing she would never forget. She had walked into that room feeling invisible. She had watched everyone else dance. She had tried to join them. Nobody had taken her hand. Until Elvis did. And perhaps that was the greatest thing he gave her that night. Not fame. Not a photograph. Not a gift. A reminder. You are not invisible. You are not unwanted. And you should never be ashamed to ask someone to dance. Because sometimes, the world doesn't change because thousands of people stand up. Sometimes, it changes because one person simply stops, looks down, reaches out a hand, and says, "Come on, dance with me." And that little girl had spent the beginning of the night believing nobody would ever choose her. But she walked out of that room knowing something she would carry for the rest of her life. She didn't need everyone to choose her. She only needed someone to see her. And on that night, Elvis Presley did. The music eventually faded. The lights began to dim. The crowd slowly disappeared. But somewhere in that room, a 7-year-old girl's laughter remained in the air. And Elvis, he walked away from that night as the same Elvis Presley everyone knew. But perhaps, just perhaps, he carried one small memory with him. A little girl, a tiny hand, a nervous smile, and one sentence he would never forget. "Elvis, nobody will dance with me." He had answered her with only 4 words. "Then dance with me." And sometimes, 4 words are enough to change someone's entire world.